Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Music Australia in Conversation with the Music Network. My name is Vivian Kelly. I'm a contributing editor and journalist with the Music Network, and I am coming to you today from the very rainy Yuin country. I would encourage you all to share where you're coming to us from in the chat and amongst yourselves, and also pay respect to all of the elders past, present, and emerging. We know that First Nations people are the longest surviving storytellers and musicians, and it is such a privilege to have some of them joining us here today. First Nations people, as I'm sure many of you have read, do form a key part of the new National Cultural Policy known as Revive. And we will be unpacking many things to do with the creation of Music Australia and the various musical elements of the Revive policy here today. This session is being recorded and will become available online next week. It is also being Auslan interpreted, so we welcome our Auslan interpreters, Yasmin and Katie, who will be rotating throughout this session to assist us. In today's panel, I will be speaking with Francesca Cubillo, the Executive Director, First Nations Arts and Culture from the Australian Council of the Arts, Adrian Collette, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Council for the Arts, and Dr. Stephen Arnott, the Deputy Secretary of the Creative Economy and the Arts. It has been a long time since Australia had a national cultural policy. So there would be people tuning in today, and last I heard it was over 1,000 people who have heard it all, seen it all, and fought for it all. But there would also be a significant number of people who have worked in the arts and music who have never done so in an environment where there's a guiding policy light, such as this new Revive National Cultural Policy. So there are a lot of questions. We'll be hearing from a number of industry voices today to get their feedback. But this is the start of the extensive consultation process that will be happening as we gear up for a new era for Australia's music industry. We'll kick things off. Goodness, I don't know where to start, but we might start with you, Adrian. Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Viv. And thanks to you and the Music Network for supporting this session. So shall I kick off?
Yes, well, I guess I would just like to know from you first, when the policy came out, what were you sort of most excited about? How did you feel?
Well, I'm very excited, of course, being responsible for the Australia Council, soon to be Creative Australia, for the changes we can make to the council itself and the much greater impact we have. But my response was pretty simple. This is great for the sector and great for the industry. And that has clearly come back to us in spades through the media and through the responses. So it's really where to from here. I'm here on Wurundjeri country, part of Naarm, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and current, and to my First Nations colleagues, and particularly Francesca, who's joining us on this call today. Thank you for all the work that you do. I also want to acknowledge my broader Australia Council colleagues, and particularly Kirsty Rivers, our Head of Practice for Music, who I know will be on the call and a strong source of advice to us as we set up Music Australia. And of course, Dr. Stephen Arnott, Deputy Secretary of the Creative Economy and the Office for the Arts. I want to acknowledge really the input from the music industry. We kind of take it for granted, but it was a tremendous advocacy and campaign that informed the cultural policy, and it just wouldn't happen without that advocacy. We know we've got a minister, and Minister Burke, who is deeply engaged with contemporary music, and indeed a Prime Minister who is. But to have the result we have got and can now work with under the constraints, the fiscal constraints of the budgeting process at the moment, I just take my hat off to all our sector colleagues who advocated so effectively and so well. I guess the big message I want to lead with everyone, and the next 3 to 6 months is going to be pretty intense, is this is not business as usual for the Australia Council. I think a modern creative Australia has the chance to really become what I think of as an investment and development agency, moving from a grant giving and advocacy body to really thinking about long-term industry development with a strong focus on building public and private partnerships. We have been given now the real opportunity to engage with the philanthropic sector, but also importantly with the commercial sector. I read yesterday a terrific article by Sophie Payton, which I think kind of got as a working musician, obviously an extraordinarily successful one, got the kind of shift we're trying to make. And she said very clearly, she doesn't think of the money she got from the Australia Council so she could do her first tour, employ the people she needed to employ, do the kind of promotion she needed to do. She never thought of that as a grant. She thought of it as an investment in capacity building, career building. And I think that's a nice distinction for us to keep in mind. I also recall Tony Burke's words when he was talking to Parliament about it. And he said, live music and contemporary music have forever been underfunded. He also mentioned literature, which is a very important thing we'll be setting up in due course, but always underfunded at a federal level. There has never been support on the basis that it's a commercial sector that looks after itself. I think that's a really important switch to pull as we take this advice, that we now have the opportunity to invest in what we call the commercial sector for long-term sustainability. Change won't occur overnight. I have to stress that. The government stages the budget allocation to us. I think that's sensible as we set this up, allowing us time to plan and consult. The legislation that sets out the Australia Council's functions does require amendment to enact key actions arising from the National Cultural Policy. But we anticipate these changes will be good to go by July 1. Stephen may be able to offer some insight there. But that's the kind of planning time that we have very much in mind. We are now working to define the governance framework for Music Australia and to scope the initiatives to be delivered by Music Australia set out in the National Cultural Policy. And it is quite specific. You know, there are a number of things that the cultural policy articulates as the responsibility of Music Australia. And we have to prioritise and work out how best to invest these precious dollars. I just want to reiterate, Viv, what you said. We really want to hear from people. We're going to hear from a really terrific panel of colleagues in a minute. But please send your comments and questions to the email address ncp@australiacouncil.gov.au, ncp@australiacouncil.gov.au, or use the form that we will also send post this session to make sure we keep hearing about sector priorities. The form we send through will have two key questions that we encourage you to respond to. First, given the role of Music Australia set out in the government's National Cultural Policy, what are the top two priorities you believe it should focus on in its early months? What are the top two priorities it should focus on in its early months? And looking ahead, what are the measures of success you want to see when Music Australia is evaluated in 2026? And I hasten to remind people that one of the responsibilities Creative Australia will have in 3 years' time is to start evaluating the impact of this investment. So we will be setting a bunch of benchmarks very soon so that we can evaluate the impact. That will inform the next iteration of the cultural policy in 5 years' time. So please help us think through those things as we're standing this up. I think that's enough from me, Viv.
Thank you for that. Look, Francesca, your role has a key and core focus on First Nations arts and culture. Can I just get a quick comment from you about how it felt to see First Nations musicians and artists mentioned so heavily and so prominently in this announcement.
Thank you, Vivian. And can I say I'm joining you from the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. And can I take this opportunity to acknowledge First Nation people who are joining us today? Elated. Of course, First Nation songlines have crisscrossed this continent since time immemorial, and First Nation creatives, song men and women and young people have been activating those songlines. And to see a national cultural policy that not only centers people and their culture, First Nations people and their culture, but really identifies clear pathways for investment. And as a First Nation woman at Council, I'm very conscious of the amazing work that has been done to date in this important area. And
okay, I think we are just having a little bit of technical difficulties with Francesca. Perhaps, look, we can try and fix Australia's arts policy, but we can't necessarily fix the internet as well. So one thing at a time, but I promise the team will do what they can to bring Francesca back as quickly as possible, because we obviously really value those insights on the First Nations arts and cultural scene, particularly with reference to music. We might just move on quickly then to see the focus of Music Australia seems to be on contemporary music. I think there'd be a lot of the 1,000 people watching today who have a different definition of contemporary music. So look, Adrian, how would you define contemporary music for Music Australia?
Thanks for the question, Viv. Listen, I'm not going to get too hung up on definitions here. In fact, the Australia Council already funds what I would think of as contemporary music through its multi-year investments, through its arts projects, through its individual and groups, and a number of now very successful commercial artists and songwriters are being funded by the Australia Council. So rather than what's contemporary or not, I just would emphasise one of the points I made in my opening remarks, that here the opportunity is to really invest in the commercial sector in a way we haven't been able to do before. We've given grants to artists, they've gone off with their extraordinary talent, and some have managed to launch successful commercial careers. But the real switch here is the invitation, in fact, the necessity to work within the industry, to work with industry experts to say, how do we invest this to build the Australian industry and the Australian sector? So, you know, whether it's how do we work on exports? We know there's a huge challenge around discoverability and touring and the costs of touring. We're back to the future on touring as a way of breaking bands overseas. And it's not just competition, it's cost. There's a big issue clearly around venues. We think of the extraordinary work that Sounds Australia has been doing, you know, really on very little money, and they've got a dedicated funding stream through Music Australia. What more can Millie and her team do to build the industry, increase the export market, which is their focus, in months and years to come? We know that Australian songwriting is kind of through the roof at the moment. Is that where we're going to spend our first tranche of money in supporting that? Obviously, artistic creation, fundamental to the work of Council, will be fundamental to the work of Music Australia. But it's the commerciality of the sector and the people who are going to give us the advice on where to fund and where to fund first that I think is really critical. So contemporary music, you ask 1,000 people, you'll get probably 400 different answers. But how to sustain the commercial sector, that's pretty exciting.
So speaking of funding, Stephen, who is going to make decisions on funding and investment for Music Australia?
Thanks, Viv. So obviously the policy sets up this new body in the Australia Council. We need to work through what the governance and decision making of that body will be, but it does sort of make it clear that the new body will have some decision making responsibilities. But part of the purpose of the consultation that we're going to run now is to work out with the industry and the sector what the best structure for Music Australia would be. So that's, yeah, we're open-minded at this stage. Just to say though that the Australia Council board and Creative Australia itself will always sort of remain the accountable authority to the minister and the parliament. So these bodies are within that corporate structure.
So Adrian, is Music Australia just for industry development then?
Well, it depends what you define as industry development. I think everything begins with investments in creative output, in artistic skills and talent. So that will remain, as I said, absolutely core to what we do. But how do you support that? How do you support that? By breaking export markets, supporting managers who tour bands, by thinking about the challenges in streaming services that makes the discoverability of Australian artists so challenged these days. A lot of issues. I heard one luminary say if COVID hadn't come along, we would have had more export acts going out in 2020 than ever before. So there's a lot there to work with. But just think, to have public funding in a commercial industry for the first time, surely there are a lot of dots we can join over the next 5 years.
And speaking of touring and discoverability and whatnot, how will support for festivals be realised with this new body?
Well, I noticed Mitch is on the line. I can ask him what he thinks. But one of the stated tasks in the NCP is we have to do a pretty extensive piece of research into the impact of festivals. So I think everyone recognises their extraordinary benefits. You know, I will make this point. It's hard to think of silver linings in COVID, but there are two that are relevant to this conversation. One is that the commercial, and let's call it the publicly funded sector, I hate all that, but they actually started talking. You know, necessity is the mother of invention. We were having far more meaningful discussions. And I don't need to labour the transfer of skills and talents that happens between the sectors. You know, we all see it working. But the other thing that happened during COVID is so much of what 1,000 people on this call do is lost in plain sight. And you take it away, and some of the big engines of government started to notice. And festivals is one of these. I mean, we saw a lot of that during the COVID time, just how much was lost, not just the festivals themselves, but the cost of that to communities, local communities, economies. So I think this piece of research, which is one of the strings we have to our bow at Creative Australia, can really begin to articulate the value that festivals have socially and communally, certainly, but also their economic impact. Some of that work's been done, but the fact that that's now been enshrined as an obligation in the cultural policy is a very nice example of how policies work.
And Stephen, one of the big headline grabbers for the music industry was, of course, the creation of the new Centre for Arts Workplaces, which will hopefully hold arts workplaces more accountable in terms of their conduct and assist artists and employees with everything from complaints of sexual misconduct to bullying. Hopefully that puts an end to some of the trauma and tragedy that we have seen throughout this industry and puts more of a spotlight on the triumphs of people who have survived that and bettered the industry. Do we have any details yet on what the Centre for Arts Workplaces will look like? Do you have any additional details that you can let us know today?
Thanks, Steve. Well, just to say that this was obviously something that was called for by the sector during the consultations and through the Raising Their Voices report that the music industry commissioned. They asked for a government industry partnership where we could provide together a safe place for people to come who are experiencing workplace bullying or harassment. The purpose of it really is to help people navigate the system. So there's a single place for arts and entertainment workers to come to raise issues. There will be, I would imagine, expertise in that centre that can appropriately advise those employees on what next steps can be taken, how the centre might be able to assist them. And the centre will work closely with the other parts of the workplace system, you know, the Fair Work Commission, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and so on, just to make sure that, you know, this system can be quite difficult to navigate. So the centre will be able to help people navigate that. It's going to be an advisory service. It's going to work closely with the sector on developing codes of conduct where those are needed. And it's going to be very closely in touch with other parts of the workplace system to make sure people get the support that they need. And one final thing to say, which the Minister has said, but just to remind everyone that, you know, funding decisions, you know, will be linked to this. So if there are employers that are not providing consistently over time a safe workplace for their employees, and that becomes apparent, that would obviously need to be considered when funding investments are made.
Perfect. Was there anything that you wanted to add there, Adrian, on this new centre?
No, but I think obviously, you know, our priority right now is to engage with the sector deeply on Music Australia, but we will be doing that when we stand up the Centre for Arts and Entertainment Workplaces as well, because there are a whole lot of other issues. Remembering this isn't an investigatory body, we'll be using some of the standing bodies like Fair Work to do it, but we will again make sure that people know what we're thinking so we can refine that as we set it up. But I'm dying to hear what some of our panel experts think are the priorities and options.
Yes, absolutely. This is, of course, one of many steps in a consultation process. So we are now going to call on some of the 1,000 plus people who are watching us today. Don't worry, they do already have the heads up. We're not just going to put you on the spot if you're in the chat and ask you to join us. We will be asking these industry voices what their top 2 priorities would be that they think Music Australia should focus on. And within that framework, we'll also be asking them what is the measure for success that they would judge Music Australia by when it's evaluated in 2026. So everyone will get to have their say. We will, of course, be taking more feedback. There will be a further feedback form available for those of you watching, and of course the email address that Adrian has mentioned as well. But now I'm going to throw to Marty Court from the Annex and get Marty to give us her take on what the focus of Music Australia should be in terms of its top 2 priorities and how she would measure success. Marty, are you up for that question?
Sure am. Hopefully everyone can see me. I'm coming from Gadigal country today, and I'd like to pay my acknowledgement and respect to elders present, past and emerging. For those of you that don't know me, I work and run an independent company that deals with independent bands around Australia, working with them, trying to break their careers and work in artist development. So from our perspective, we would like to see more export funding for independent artists that are rewriting the business model by owning their own creative output. I think it's a very interesting point in this kind of country's collective, in the fact that a lot of these artists are coming through and have never had any funding and yet are still trying to make sure that they're making their own way in the world. Rights retention will give them greater return in the long run, but in the short term, independent bands are continually hamstrung with cash flow issues. This relates not only to international touring, which we all have to admit is pretty untenable at the moment due to the global financial crisis, but also bringing international support teams on board that help artists promote themselves and drive their music across the globe. You shouldn't automatically be at a disadvantage in your career by choosing to retain the rights to your arts and investing in yourself. Secondly, given the government's policies commitment to First Nations, we would also like to see this commitment transferred to the business side of the music industry, focusing on pathways into the workforce for young talent. It is vital that there are programs in place to allow development in the corporate world and support the talent to make sure we retain people in the industry. This also includes training corporations and the broader industry on ensuring there are safe workplaces for First Nations people. In terms of measurement of success, the first one would be a more skilled and diverse workforce, driving our collective creative culture forwards. Furthermore, we would love to see that contemporary music gets the recognition it deserves in terms of adding export dollars to the domestic economy. Personally, it'd be great to convince the Australian public that neo-soul is worth more than coal and hardcore more than iron ore.
Thank you so much for that, Marty. I would personally hate to follow that very insightful and almost musical speech there, but I'm sure our next person can absolutely handle it and is up to the task. That person is Mitchell Wilson, the Managing Director of the Australian Festival Association. So coming at it from quite a different but equally important perspective. Mitchell, can you please lay out for us and for everyone watching what your top two priorities would be for Music Australia and how you'll measure its success in 2026?
Yeah, thanks, Viv. Mitch Wilson here from the Festival Association, Zoom in from Gadigal, and my pronouns are they, them. I think the two sort of priorities from a festival and live music perspective for us would be having a body like Music Australia within government to tasked to advocate on behalf of the industry is, a huge step. We want to make sure that the representation of live and festivals is covered in the sort of governance of that body so that it can adequately advocate for us. Festivals and touring are seeing a huge increase in supplier costs because of labour shortages across the sector. I think the Jobs and Skills Australia body that's being set up definitely needs to have a strong music and arts and entertainment focus, and having a particular sort of body to advocate in, organisations like that is going to be a huge effort. I think the second side, we're really still struggling recovering from the COVID lockdowns. Festivals in particular last year were trying to get their first events off the ground, but we're seeing the increase in supplier costs. Ticket sales were sort of all over the place. It wasn't really consistent and still quite soft. And then on top of that, the sort of La Nina extreme weather events meant that a lot of our members had to cancel their first festival back. We only saw Laneway Festival last weekend. Their first leg over in Auckland had to cancel, as well as the Elton John tour. So it's still a real immediate problem for us that we are struggling to get back on our feet. So I think some of the RISE funding didn't necessarily go to, supporting Australian artists, and Live Music Australia funding is running out next year. I think having a live and festivals representative in Music Australia to ensure that the $70 million allocated to it, comes our way and sort of is able to help the sort of music festival sector is a key priority. And then just on the success side, I think everyone's going to say similar things. We want to see more Aussie artists on lineups. We want to see export happening so that Australian artists can, tour on festivals all over the world, and artists can really sort of make a full-time job out of it and not feel like they're, living paycheck to paycheck or invoice to invoice. Thanks for the shout out earlier, Adrian. I think the festival research is going to be a huge level measure of success from our end, just so that we've got a lay of the land of the sort of regulatory environment so that I can advocate, especially at a state and territory level, to sort of start a bit of a competition around who can be the most festival friendly state. But yeah, that's it from our end.
Thank you very much, Mitch, for their insights there. One of the things that they mentioned, of course, was the toll of the past few years, whether it's been COVID or extreme weather, and somebody who would be very familiar with the toll that that can take on people within this industry is Clive Miller, the CEO of Support Act, which I'm sure you all know plays an incredibly important role. So from your perspective, Clive, which again is different from the ones we've heard so far, but very important, what two priorities do you want to see Music Australia focusing on, and how will you and Support Act measure that success come 2026?
Thanks, Vivian, and greetings from Gadigal land, and I also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I guess I want to speak to the two areas that are most relevant to Support Act, and I think they probably complements to Music Australia. The first is the establishment of the Centre for Arts and Arts and Entertainment Workplaces. Just building on what Stephen and Adrian said earlier, we really see this as a game changer when it comes to making all businesses aware of their responsibilities to provide psychologically safe workplaces that are free from harassment, bullying, discrimination and sexual misconduct. This has been an area of specific interest and engagement for Support Act over the past few years. We've been delighted to work in partnership with the Music Industry Review and others who have been raising really important awareness around these issues. And we've also developed a significant program, as you've suggested there, in relation to education and training to help the industry prioritise psychological safety and to create mentally healthy workplaces, which we think will lead to sustained cultural and behavioural change. So in terms of the measures of success that we would hope to see within the next 4 years is that we've been able to work in partnership with the centre and our colleagues in industry to ensure that the majority of businesses have embraced things like our minimum standards and any other workplace codes that might be needed, that they have implemented policies and procedures that help music workers to understand their rights and responsibilities, that ensure they have access to support services if they need them, and that the majority of staff have that actually have had the opportunity to undertake education and training programs that can act as preventative measures in this area. And of course, in relation to crisis relief and the ongoing financial struggles that music workers experience, we also hope that the centre can make real progress when it comes to ensuring that all music workers get properly paid for their work. The second priority area for us is the policy to put First Nations first. At Support Act, we've discovered how transformational it is to have First Nations people on staff, to authentically acknowledge First Nations people's contribution to culture, to understand the systems and structures and attitudes that create mental and physical ill health, to promote self-determination, which encourages our First Nations team to guide decision-making, and to be consciously trying to ensure that we work with First Nations businesses. So I guess when it comes to the 2026 evaluation, our First Nations team would like to see more businesses across the industry being declared or considered as culturally safe, culturally intelligent, but they note that that can only happen if more First Nations people are employed across all facets of the industry and given agency over decision-making.
Great, thank you so much, Clive. Lots of work to be done, I have to say, with all of these insights so far. I'm not too envious of the team at Music Australia and all the things that they're going to have to do. I'm sure we have another perspective to come again from Dean Ornston, the CEO of APRA AMCOS. Dean, you have another insight, I'm sure, and another perspective working for a different industry body. So from the APRA AMCOS perspective, what do you think the top 2 priorities for Music Australia should be? And I guess there's another music industry body who also has to be held accountable and measure its own success. How will you judge Music Australia's performance, Dean?
Thanks, Vivian. And yeah, hello to everyone on Gadigal land today. And it's absolutely thundering down in the background here, like it probably is for others. Just before I get onto that, I wanted to say congrats and thank you to both Adrian and Stephen and the teams behind everything we're talking about today. And obviously, it's been a long journey in getting the National Cultural Policy constructed and launched. And in a sense, I think it ticks a first box in a measure of success, certainly from an APRA AMCOS point of view, and I know many in the industry, around visibility, and for our industry to be recognised as an industry. And it's one of the things that I think has been a key objective for our industry and also a measure of success, which is to be recognised as an industry. And then with the subsequent engagement with government, policy and strategic investment to follow. And the second part of that, congrats and thanks, is to, I think, the many, many people on this call who've been part of focus groups and conversations and submissions over the last 2 years in the midst of COVID and coming out of that, in coming together collectively to put a picture together that makes it easy for government to pick up and respond to. So I think it's really important to sort of acknowledge the many views that have come together as part of that process. And that probably sort of goes really to what I would suggest key sort of requirements to Music Australia kicking off pretty quickly, and that is establishing a framework, an ongoing framework for consultation across the industry. So in relation to formulating priorities and policies and action, you can already see from many of the comments in the chat here, a breadth of consultation that has people comfortable with what the definition of Music Australia is and what we mean by contemporary music. And I don't think we need to leave anybody behind. Certainly in terms of the breadth of APRA AMCOS's membership, it is genre agnostic. And I think that is the opportunity of Music Australia. As part of that, I think another critical part of Music Australia is changing the perception, both across government and publicly, around the opportunity of Australian contemporary music. We celebrate our sports success, which is to take nothing from sport, but there's something to be learned from that around how do we invest in and nurture the breadth of those involved in the Australian music industry and look at fast tracking the opportunity for the stars in that space, both locally and globally. So that's a more general sort of opportunity, I think, in terms of Music Australia. In terms of the specifics, I mean, much of that information has been provided by the contemporary industry. So the contemporary industry has come together with 18 industry groups. Most of them will be on this call today in articulating core asks in terms of policy areas for Music Australia to address. And just to highlight a couple of those, which I think will be critical to look at, is around education and the role of music in the education space. And as I say that out loud, it is such an enormous area in and of itself. But from an APRA AMCOS perspective, songwriting is at the heart of our entire industry. And it is really the beginning of the journey through to becoming a powerhouse music nation, as we've said in many contexts, and also the opportunity of export and ultimately being a net exporter. So looking to the opportunity of education. And if I take a step further along that ecosystem line, the next point I would put to as highlight as a priority would be around the live music ecosystem and the venue-based live music ecosystem. And just to share with people on this call, APRA statistics show that the live music sector is barely operating at 70% of pre-COVID activity. So we have a crisis in live music within venues, and that is something we would look forward to working with Music Australia on. In terms of measuring success, I've just gone blank on whether the question was really after a 12-month period or a longer period. And
2026, Dean.
2026, good. We'll give everybody a little bit of time. But certainly, I think going back to what I said at the beginning, if we've moved the dial on both governments, perception and engagement with our industry, and by that I would mean that our back-end engagement is whole of government, cross government. So the fact that we will be interfacing with the education portfolio, with trade, together with arts and communications and other portfolios, I think that would be a great measure of success. So that, and presumably from a government point of view, that funding and all other matters aren't incumbent on one portfolio, but there is a relationship to many government portfolios will be a measure of success. And I think also in the more immediate sense, a plan for achieving that longer term vision where our industry does feel like there's a voice through Music Australia and a shared vision. And through that, we will, by definition, need to prioritise immediate and longer term actions. But I think if there's clarity around that, in the shorter term, in the more immediate term, that will be a great measure of success.
Great, thanks, Dean. I can see a few questions popping up in the chat about engaging with First Nations people more effectively. And very unfortunately, we did lose Francesca Cabillo earlier in the call, who is the Executive Director, First Nations Arts and Culture for the Australian Council of the Arts. She was having some technical difficulties, but even from the bits that we could hear, you could hear Francesca's passion for First Nations songlines and stories and creativity. So there will be more consultation and engagement going on with First Nations people, and there will be more opportunities to hear from the AusCo First Nations team in coming months. So we absolutely haven't forgotten the priority and importance of that. We now also need to throw to, goodness, I've lost track of where we are. Kath Harrity, the CEO of the Australian Music Centre. Kath, we've rapidly run out of time because there is so much to talk about, but we do want to hear very quickly, if you can, your top 2 priorities for Music Australia and how you would measure success, Kath.
Certainly, thank you. I'll be as brief as humanly possible. I'm the CEO of the Australian Music Centre. We're a national service-based not-for-profit representing independent creators and composers in the art music community. And I'm coming to you from sunny Wurundjeri country. Based on the objectives, we believe that Music Australia should lead initial research and data gathering, clearly defining and mapping who we are, encompassing our diverse and incredible art music creators. Further, we want to see artist sustainability and income generation and music discoverability prioritised. We also believe Music Australia should lead the development of a co-investment agreement with states and territories and with the music industry, as this will truly secure a strong foundation. And a key measure of success will be the impact of the work undertaken on our artists' financial stability and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you for doing that so succinctly. I've been given permission to go to go over by just a couple of minutes, only so that we can hear from Annabelle Hurd, the CEO of ARIA and PPCA. Annabelle, I'm putting you under a time crunch, but I'm sure you've heard me ask the question 1,000 times already. So please give us your say, Annabelle. Do we have Annabelle there? I can see her in the lineup. I think you were on mute. Classic. We had to get there.
Of course it's me. I'm Gadigal Land in the pouring rain. I'll be very quick and quite specific. I support everything everyone else has said. We have an urgent crisis in streaming of new Australian music at the moment. We have a massive problem with discoverability and promotion of new Australian music. It's not just Australia. New music is struggling to be heard around the world, but it is particularly hitting our music and our artists. You can see that there are very few Australian albums or singles in our ARIA charts at the moment. It's not just a streaming issue, but I'm so pleased that we will have a body like Music Australia to quickly bring a focus and a point where we can have a conversation with industry, streaming companies, and government to talk about what is happening and what we need to do, because we need to do it quickly. Radio is obviously a part of that conversation, because as most of us on this call know, you can drive a truck through the radio quotas at the moment. And it's not an easy problem to solve, but it is an urgent one. Also not a talent problem. We have incredible talent, including a couple of artists which I think are on this call and will be on the board of Music Australia, I understand from what the Minister has said, which is very important. The second one is related, and others have mentioned a massive push that we need on export of Australian music. We know what international success does for the artist, for cultural diplomacy, for success here and overseas. And we have to get a massive export push off the ground ASAP, because it's pretty difficult at the moment. Measures of success, pretty simple: demonstrated growth in streaming and consumption of new Australian music in all genres, both in Australia and overseas, which means we have to start measuring this, going to the measurement point. This will lead to more Australian music in the charts here and overseas, and that will help more local artists make a really good living, as well as their teams and all the businesses represented here as a result. So my two priorities.
Great. Thank you so much, Annabelle, and also to Clive, Kath, Dean and Marty and Mitchell. I have seen a question come through about whether or not we're going to hear from any musicians. We won't today, but they absolutely are going to be part of the consultation process. And that might be a great point for me to throw back to Adrian, just to check if he had any final remarks on this ongoing consultation process and how people such as musicians who we haven't heard from today can get involved in this consultation process, Adrian.
Indeed, no, we will be talking to musicians, and the Minister's also been very clear musicians will be on the board of Music Australia, so it is a critical voice. In listening to all this, I've been making copious notes, of course, but these issues, as a couple of people have said, there's been really good and concerted consultation in the industry, so we have a lot to start with. You know, we're not going back to basics. We're not going to over-consult the industry. The purpose of this is just to get a sense of the priorities. And the reason they sound familiar is because we have read all the applications to the National Cultural Policy. And I think one of the things we're excited about is the cultural policy, which, you know, no one's pretending it's born perfect, but it's early in a government's tenure. And I think people are feeling their voices have been heard. So please keep in contact. We will be emailing, as I said, soon after this meeting. So use it to respond to us. Also, National Cultural Policy at australiacouncil.gov.au. We're not going to overburden the sector with consultation because so much has been done and the big priorities are emerging. And I'd just finish by stressing that whole of government point. I heard it in so many of the comments from the panelists, that the Albanese government has adopted this policy. Minister Burke was very clear, this wasn't an arts policy, it was a cultural policy. And the reason we need a cultural policy is to get some of this stuff done, you have to be talking to education, you have to be talking to foreign affairs. You certainly have to be talking to Indigenous affairs. People around this table know the script as well as I do, but we have a policy lever now to do that. So I just want to thank everyone for the feedback. In the best sense, as challenging as it is, there is a consistency to it that that should make us reasonably sure-footed as we set this thing up.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian Collette there, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Council for the Arts. Thank you also to Dr. Stephen Arnott, the Deputy Secretary of the Creative Economy and the Arts, and of course, Francesca Cubillo, who we lost earlier in the call, the Executive Director of First Nations Arts and Culture at the Australian Council for the Arts. As myself and Adrian have mentioned quite a few times, now is your chance to provide feedback. This recording will become available on the Australia Council of the Arts website. So if you have any remaining questions on what was said here today, you will be able to rewatch it. There will also be forms and emails that you can send to let this esteemed panel know exactly how you feel, which I can tell from the chat many of you will do. I can feel your passion radiating through Australia's very dodgy NBN. I can feel it all the way here from Yuin country. So thank you very much to all of our panelists and of course our incredible Auslan interpreters, who I also saw getting a few shout outs in the chat for their incredible work. That is Yasmin and Katie. My name is Vivian Kelly. I'm a contributing editor and journalist at the Music Network, and I thank you very much for joining us in conversation about Music Australia today.
Thanks, Vivian. Thanks, everyone.